Israel's Knesset has elected Jewish Agency Chairman Isaac Herzog as the country's 11th president. Every 7 years, a new president is chosen for the largely figurehead role. Herzog comes from a long line of distinguished Israeli leaders.
I intend to be the president of everyone, to listen attentively to every position and to respect every person, to mark connecting lines and build bridges of agreement in order to bring closer the far most zealots, here within us, as well as with our brothers and sisters in the diaspora.
Isaac Herzog's father played an incredible role in the history of Israel. One of those moments came in the spring of 1967, a time of almost unbearable tension for Israel's leaders. Threats of invasion came from every direction, and Western allies turned their backs. Egypt shut down the Red Sea, while Syria shelled Galilee's villages. But in Israel's darkest hour, a voice of calm emerged to describe the coming miracle. John Wagi explains.
By the end of May 1967, the die was cast. Israel would soon be at war on all borders. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol tried to reassure the nation, but he was ill and faltered during his address. Military General Chaim Herzog stepped in to fill the gap with radio commentary in Hebrew and English.
A new page has been opened in the history of our people's battles and of the courage of Israel. And deep in the heart of each and every one of us at this moment, when we think of those engaged in the struggle, there is, irrespective of whether we normally pray or not, a prayer that the guardian of Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep.
During the Six-Day War, Chaim Herzog didn't just calm the nation. He became Israel's first military ruler over Judea and Samaria in more than 2,000 years. He was also a powerful presence as UN ambassador and later as president of Israel. Chaim Herzog died in 1997, but his legacy lives on. His son Isaac was only 7 when the war broke out. Still, he remembers the prevailing fear.
What we know is that there was a period of awaiting about 3 weeks before the war, where the national mood was Auschwitz. Israel is going to its second Holocaust. Whoever leaves last should turn off the light and leave the country. That was the mood.
Isaac's older brother Michael, now a retired major general, was 15 at the time. He says there's no doubt Israelis were concerned about the nation's survival.
So I still remember ourselves, like many other people in Israel, digging trench in our backyard because we expected that we would be shelled, and we were shelled. Tel Aviv was shelled by the Jordanians during the Six-Day War.
The young people who have abandoned the cafes of Dizengoff Street and the discotheque, the farm boys, the yeshiva students, the members of the youth movements, the boys of the immigrant townships, all are at this moment shoulder to shoulder fighting in the air, on the land, and on the sea for our right simply to live.
You know what's interesting is we hear a lot today about the term fake news and that kind of thing. 67 was a banner year for fake news, especially in Egypt and in Syria, and your father was kind of counteracting that to a people that didn't know really what was happening. They had to hear the truth.
We would hear what was called Kol Kahir, voice of Cairo, and they would speak in Hebrew, and they would say the worst things. We're going to throw you to the sea. I guess you heard it.
They said terrible things, and there was anxiety, but he provided very professional analysis. He first of all, he knew the situation.
I am broadcasting from Jerusalem to the sound of heavy shelling. A strange form of quiet and anticipation has fallen along the front line, a quiet that may foretell great tidings.
He would broadcast 3 times a day. He would also broadcast in English, so there were both BBC and others, but the 3 times a day you would walk in the streets of Tel Aviv and you would hear his voice throughout the city, people just listening, stopping and listening. And it was awesome. I heard his voice in the trench. I heard my dad, my mom brought a little radio, and we would hear him in the trench, and he calmed us down.
I was told by soldiers in the front lines, and they would listen to him, and I was told by quite a few of them that this really boosted their morale before going into battle.
Just 1 day into the war, Israel's Air Force virtually destroyed the capacity of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan to strike from the air. On the ground, Israel's army penetrated deep into the Sinai and pushed toward Jordan on the West Bank. By day 3, Chaim Herzog could tell the nation the unthinkable. After 2 millennia, Jerusalem was back in Jewish hands.
The miracle of our generation continues, as does the brilliant campaign, the like of which there is no record of in the history of Israel, and perhaps in the history of the nations, and which has achieved today what millions of Jews throughout the generations have prayed for.
We live in a very different era than 1967, but in my mind, what our father, the impact his broadcast had on the national morale is reminiscent of the impact that Churchill's broadcast had on British morale during World War II, and that was very significant.
And indeed the saying goes, Jerusalem is a gift of the whole land of Israel. On the altar of the Temple Mount and Mount Moriah, the people of Israel offered up today priceless sacrifices which swell the toll of sacrifice by earlier generations. Our victory was not lightly achieved, and at this moment it is well that we remember those who offered up their lives for the glory of the Almighty and the nation.
John Wagi, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Alpha,